Good morning. Thank you all for coming here today. Part of what I'm supposed to be addressing is a changing culture of assessment, because one of the things that Middle State said is when they came here on their site visit is that the college really doesn't have a culture of assessment. What we're really talking about is organizational change. And so part of what I want to think about is a lot of what Professor White covered was the structural stuff that's taking place. And that's important, but culture is really also about the language we use and the way that our activities are meaningful or not. And so is assessment something that's meaningful for us, or is it a piece of paper to turn in? And that's kind of where we've been stuck. And so that's what I want to think about today. What Professor White was talking about are really the structures that we've been changing. Middle State said we didn't do things well. And if you can think about it, part of the structure, and I'm being sociology boy today, so I just get to do that every so often. And the classical definition of a structure in sociology is a relatively stable pattern of relationships. Think of it this way: it's the things we do every single day. It's those routine patterns of behavior. It's also at the beginning of the semester, hey, what's your assessment plan for the year? Who's in charge of doing your Appendix E and I? Who's writing the program review this year? It's those basic work patterns. It's the routine things we do every day. Assessment has been structured into our college in a variety of ways. Part of it, as we can see, is the Appendix E and I. And actually, it was a hilarious conversation the other day. I'm one of the members of the Academic Planning Subcommittee, and we had a conversation about how many appendices we have, and how they're all appendices to different documents, and they're like multiple appendices A, none of which have any meaning. And it's just, now we've got Appendix L. It's always an appendix, but it's a document, not meaningful work. And I think that's part of this. We can see the ways that we do program reviews. And this is something that comes up consistently is, anybody read this? Why we turn this paper in? It doesn't have any kind of impact. It's paper for the sake of paper. And the same sort of thing with our faculty portfolios. We have to have a section on assessment, but is it meaningful assessment? So these are the ways that we already structure or organize assessment into the ways we do our work. And a significant part of what's happening, as Professor White discussed, is we're changing those structures. Okay? We're going to be doing program reviews on a 4-year cycle instead of a 5-year cycle. That's a significant change. That changes the program outcomes that you look at and how often you look at those. For some folks with external accreditors, this is less of a big deal than those of us that don't have external accreditors. We've already changed through the governance process the structure of Appendix E and I. Those two things are different now. We're changing the ways that, and this is going to be a significant issue, the ways that we do restricted electives. Currently, it's just take a humanity, but we're not sure which general education requirement that's supposed to meet. Is it communication? Is it diversity? It's just a humanity. So there are some significant structural changes or organizational changes that have already taken place but are coming down the pike and are necessary. Okay? The other side of it for me, though, is culture. Kalina did all the structural stuff and covered most of it. And as a sociologist, and I know I love playing sociology boy, it's an analytical distinction between structure and culture that it's useful to think about, but it's not really real. Okay? Structures are cultured. The activities we do on a daily basis have meaning to us. Okay? So the assessment activities, one of the things that keeps coming back is that assessment isn't meaningful. Okay? And that's where culture comes in. It's sort of like the meaningful ways in which a group of people live their lives together. Why do we value assessment? To turn in paperwork. What should the value of assessment be? Student learning. Those are slightly different, well, not slightly, significantly different values that influence the way we talk about and work on the things we do. Okay, and so that's the key thing, is values are the meaningful judgments we make. Student learning should be at the center of all this, as opposed to, I turned in my piece of paperwork to make sure I got it done. Language is how we talk about these things. And so part of what I want to think about is what is the language we use? Who's doing the assessment plan? Which outcomes are you measuring this year, and what standardized measure are everyone going to use? Okay? And the basic message often at these discipline meetings is, let's just get this crap done so we can get out of here. Okay? It's not necessarily about measuring student learning so much as it is about getting a piece of paper and a plan for turning paper in. Have you submitted your Appendix E or I? Well, what the hell is the Appendix E or I for? I remember when I came to this place, I didn't know what these things were. It's an appendix. What is the meaning of the Appendix E or I? It's to get things done. Turn in your CAT and you'll be entered into a drawing. What's a CAT? Classroom assessment technique, but what is it supposed to be doing? Okay. Who's going to write the program review? Nobody wants to do that. In part because it's a lot of work, in part because it don't matter. I mean, honestly, how many of us have said, does anyone actually read these? There's supposed to be an appendix, another appendix, an Appendix G that attaches budgetary requests and resource allocation to program reviews. That loop never gets connected. And so that's kind of what we want to think about today, is if we're talking about cultural change and organizational change, what does a culture of assessment look like? So first of all, do we value filing paperwork and meeting goals, or do we value student learning? One of the things that always comes up is, are we conflating grading and assessment? They're not the same thing. Okay? A grade is a mastery at some point. Assessment is an ongoing process. Are we paying not only attention to not only how many students got it wrong, but the patterns of getting it wrong? One of the things I find, and I'm not sure if everyone else does this on their campuses with Scantrons, it'll tell you how many students got a question wrong, but it won't give you the pattern of how they got it wrong. I can't tell you how many students chose which wrong answer. That's useful information for assessment, but our technology does not allow us to make that assessment. Are we measuring outcomes for courses that aren't part of our problem, our process? In many cases, we make an assessment plan, and I'm assuming this is the case for most of our disciplines. It's the intro-level course that we choose. What are the outcomes for the other courses? Are we measuring those learning outcomes, and are we connecting them to our goals? Very often we're not. Okay? So that's the other thing, and then at the bottom I've got objective met. Middle States hated this. And we were actually just doing this in academic planning the other day with the nuclear medical technology, I believe it was. And they've got about an 80 to 85 to 90% passage rate on boards, and they still wrote in their program review areas for improvement. And that's what Middle States wants to see from all of us. Even if we're meeting a certain number of goals, some students aren't. And how can we improve our instruction, our technology, our budget, all of these things to improve those learning outcomes? That's the key issue. So, a culture of assessment, I'm going to skip that because I've already been talking about it all the time. The culture of assessment values student learning across the entire thing. And most of us are doing this already. It's just, and this is the weird thing about doing this culture of assessment. I'm talking about a culture of paperwork and as opposed to a culture of student learning, but we're creating a new culture of paperwork, which is its own bizarreness. But the key thing is, how do we talk about these things? I want, and I think the assessment work group is also on board with me on this, we need to move away from a language of CATs. The CAT is a form. What we're really doing is formative assessment. And that's the ongoing process by which we're making sure students are getting the stuff we're trying to teach them. This week in class, I gave my students an exercise where their responsibility was to create a research design. Okay? I'm not grading that heavily. I'm just saying check, check plus, that kind of thing, and including, excuse my language, a ton of commentary about where they're having some issues in order to get ready for the test. Formative assessment is the stuff we do in the classroom before the summative assessment. Summative assessment is, did they get it? Formative assessment is, are they getting it? And if you think about the ways that nursing operates, for example, they're skills labs. They're constantly working with students to make sure they know how to inject a needle the right way. Pretty good thing. And so the key thing is the formative assessment is, hi, you're missing this point, how to do it. The summative assessment at the end is, can you do it? Okay? And that's the thing. We've had a discussion of classroom assessment techniques without connecting them to any broader process. The CAT existed for the CAT's sake. The CAT existed to fulfill a requirement from middle states the last time around. What is the purpose of the CAT? It's formative assessment. So one of the things we're going to start talking about is moving away from a language of CATs toward a language of assessment that includes, are they mastering the skills? Have they mastered the skills? What do we need to do to change instruction so that they're getting that point? That's the key issue with formative and summative assessment. Another part of the language we want to talk about is direct and indirect measures. Direct measures are those that are basically, did they get it right or wrong? We're measuring the outcomes of student performance. Indirect measures are, do they think they got it? What is their experience? Do they think, one of the things we find is they may have a certain skill but not be aware they have it. If they ain't know they got it, how they going to use it? Okay? And so part of this is really the issue of not only assessing the outcomes on exams or papers, et cetera, but also listening to the students about, does this exercise work or does that exercise work? And the ways that we are paying attention to the ways our students themselves understand the learning process. And that's significant here as well. So it's the formative and the summative. It's the learning along the process and finally getting the outcome. It's the measures that we make as direct outcomes, as well as the measures we take of student perception of learning. And then the other issue is, are our tools any good? We often find across a discipline, people will use different tools. Are we measuring the same thing? That's the issue of reliability. Are we all measuring the same thing? And sometimes when we all use a standardized, and I know this is a favorite technique, if we use a standardized multiple choice question across all sections, we can kind of assume that that's a reliable measure. Okay? But the other side of that is validity. Are we measuring what we actually think we're measuring? Okay? And this is a key concept within the social sciences. And I deal with this all the time. For example, in a paper that I give my students on racial discrimination in employment, one of the things they discuss is that measuring wages is not a valid measure of employment discrimination. You're measuring a different concept. And so part of it, when we look at our course program and general education goals, are we actually measuring what we think we're measuring? And are we doing so in a way that is consistent across the institution so that we can guarantee that we're meeting those goals? Okay? And so that's really the key thing here today is culture is the way that we make our life together. And part of that is using a common language that reflects a common set of values. And so if we're really thinking about what a culture of assessment means, it's not a culture of paperwork, even though we're doing more paperwork. It's a culture of, is our students learning? And I think that's really the key thing here. And how are we integrating measurements of that into our syllabi, our program reviews, our assessment, and our budgetary processes? And I think that's the key thing where we have been falling short. And we're trying to create both structural and cultural changes to the way we as an organization operate.